Hello, my name is Koelle Simpson, and I'm the founder of the Koelle Institute for Equus Coaching. And I have invited my very dear friend, Fred Donaldson, to join me. And I wanted to chat with you a little bit about kind of noticing this incredible epidemic of loneliness. But before we talk about that, would you mind just saying hello and introducing yourself?
Oh, hi, Koelle. It's good to be with you again. I'm Fred Donaldson. I have been playing with children and animals for 45 years all over the world and have learned some basic fundamental traits of how to survive in life from those beings, from children and animals. Traits that as an adult I had either left to be dormant, forgotten about, or never knew in the first place.
Yeah. So I'm a huge fan of the work that you do all around the world. And I'm incredibly grateful to have your friendship and to be able to tap you on the shoulder and ask you questions like this. But I was in Colorado just a few weeks ago, and I was walking by a park, and I sat down next to this park, and I just kind of wanted to watch. I wanted to watch people. I wanted to experience, what was going on. And as I did, I noticed something incredibly interesting. So I noticed that people were turning their dogs loose. And the dogs were playing this way and that way and every which way. And they were, scoping each other out and chasing things. And the dogs were having this incredible time together. And the people were all sitting on the periphery of the park. No one was looking at each other. A couple of people were tracking their dogs. But most of the time, everybody was just sort of looking at their phones, and no one was talking to anybody. And I sat there and I thought, wow, isn't this interesting? And I began to notice in that environment how lonely I was feeling myself. I started to think, how isn't this interesting, this feeling that we have created? So then I got super curious. And when I got back to the house where I was staying, I started to do a little bit of research, and I looked up online, and I realized something that I had been feeling, but I had never taken the time to really look up the scope and scale. And that was that we are in an epidemic of loneliness. And the research was saying, recent research, 2018 research was saying that over half of the Americans in the United States feel incredibly lonely. And, that people aren't having, even if they're surrounded by family or surrounded by colleagues and coworkers, the majority of people are not feeling connected. They're feeling this incredible depth of loneliness. They also mentioned that social media is not an experience of connection. It actually is an experience of more isolation, and tends to create more of an experience of loneliness and more of an experience of, more symptoms of depression. So I thought that was quite fascinating, because you see people doing all of these things to try to stay connected with one another, communicate with one another. We have a larger population of human beings on this planet than we've ever had. And so I wanted to chat with you about this, because I thought it was really important for us to look at. What do you think is one of the contributing factors that you see to this epidemic of loneliness?
Oh, I think it starts pretty young. And we get to be afraid of the kind of contact that you observed in the dogs. So we begin even young to tell our children, be afraid of strangers. Our children go from maybe a school environment in the morning of preschool, and then they go home and spend their time on the electronic gadgets. And it's not just a wish for old times, to remember that when I was a child, I spent all the time outdoors, all the time connecting with kids, running around, being with each other, with no adult interaction or supervision of any kind, except when we played organized sports. And now I see kids who have virtually no interaction or outdoor time when they go home. And the only time they interact is at school, and most of those relationships are controlled by teachers. And they're pretty restrained. When you sit at a desk or at a table all day, you have maybe a half hour to run around outside with a few kids, but you don't have time to develop any lengthy kinds of relationships out there. And if you don't have an experience at the beginning of how to introduce yourself, how to engage with other beings that you don't know, it gets a little bit tougher as you get older. And we start to look for what I call membership rather than belonging. And membership is like a gang. Membership is based on exclusion. I'm a member, you're not. Where belonging is what the dogs did. Everybody's in. And what very young children taught me, well, there's no outsider to this. Everybody belongs. And I mean everybody. And every being. It was how I was first introduced to how to be with snakes. Snakes were not one of my favorite things. And I was working at a school and went out into the environment around the school, which was in Southern California in the hills. And there were rattlesnakes, just doing what rattlesnakes do. And the kids just wandered around, stepped over them, walked around as if they were just sticks. There was no fear on either the part of the children or the snakes. And I thought, wow, you can do that? Wow, I didn't believe you could do that. So they were teaching, the children didn't interact any differently with each other than they did with snakes. Everybody was included, nobody to be afraid of. But if you grow up in an environment that starts to breed competition and loneliness, you're afraid. And once that fear starts to escalate, it's very difficult to step outside because you don't have a model and you haven't learned a model. And it takes then courage, and it's much easier to just do what's easy, just do what everyone around you is doing, to exclude people, to attack. And there's a book by Richard Wilkinson on economic inequality and the factors that go into that, and how each country in the world is related to that. In the United States, and all these characteristics of teenage violence, obesity, trust, loneliness is way off the charts. We're worse than virtually all the countries in the world.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that we can be that bad and probably still be the most technologically connected.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at somebody who says how many, followers you have on Facebook, and somebody says I have 1 million, and they're lonely, what good are 1 million followers? I don't get it. Doesn't make any sense. And right, social media does not promote the kind of interaction we need. When I play with kids around the world, I find that kids who tend to be at least labeled violent, aggressive, are much easier to play with. They exhibit far less violence and aggression than, quote, normal kids. And that's a surprise to me. But I think it's based on fear.
Yeah.
Normal kids just don't know how.
And that's one of the things that I always sort of turn to nature, and I always turn to learning from horses specifically, but always nature at large, because nature is not carrying around a cultural story. It's just being itself in the moment, experiencing, expressing, and living. And when I look to a horse herd, I recognize right away that we, very much like the rest of the social animals, we are meant to be living in connection and in community with one another. And to me, one of the things that stands out is how much the cultural stories that we've been given have fostered a intense feeling of shame and inadequacy. And so most people, once they start to reach like early preteen age, begin to feel that sort of story or sense of one way or another in which they're not enough. Not intelligent enough, not smart enough, not the right skin color, not the right financial bracket. This sort of really gets shaped by the way that we educate, by the way that we mentor, by the way that we design sports. As you were saying, everything kind of becomes this compare and despair. And you see it in media. You certainly see it in social media, where people are trying to, get a situation where they're liked, or they get attention, or they get, some kind of recognition, but the feeling is completely empty.
Yes.
Because there's no real actual depth of connection. And one of the things that I notice when I look at animals in nature, and as you said, really young children, you see this level of vulnerability and open-heartedness and innocence that I think is one of the primary elements that allows for that depth of connection. I've mentioned this a few times before, but it seems to me that the connection amongst human relationships, most especially adults, has become an experience that is somewhat traumatic. And I think, because everybody's scared, people keep replaying this sort of sense of inadequacy and then judgment onto the other when we get afraid. We start to project our fears. And it really creates this environment that becomes very difficult for people to connect. And so isolation becomes the safer choice.
Yeah.
The problem is that the isolation, really begins to affect our health. They know it cuts down now on our longevity of life. And for sure, it really wreaks havoc on our quality of life in terms of actually being able to have an experience of feeling love, care, connection, and feeling alive in your own life. So, I wonder, what are your thoughts? As I was sitting in this park, I was watching these dogs just, again, that beautiful wisdom from Mother Nature, just knowing at the core how to be with one another, how to play, how to connect. What do you think is one of the sort of stepping stones for adults to begin this approach towards allowing themselves to connect, towards actual experiences of play?
I think you're right that it's essentially based on fear. When I was working with cancer patients, adults who had been diagnosed with cancer and they were said to be dying of their cancer, they said to me at the beginning, the patient said to me, "Fred, why Do my family and friends think that cancer is contagious? You know it's not. And I thought, what are they talking about? Nobody believes cancer is contagious. And they said, well, once they were diagnosed, everybody moved away from them, even family, separated themselves. And I thought, really? Wow, that seems strange. Until I was diagnosed with cancer. Then I saw it, then I felt it. People just evaporated and moved away. And I thought, oh my God, that's what the people are talking about. And I realized that they're afraid, even though all the logic, all the science tells them the opposite. Science does very little to dispel fear. It's not good at that. The only thing I know that does it is love. And it can begin with very small things, almost not noticeable, to make connections. And we, even though we don't live it, scientifically we know that the most powerful way humans have, animals too, of creating that sense of belonging is touch. But my God, we're afraid of that. Oh geez. With all the things going on in the United States about sexual harassment, was it every day some CEO is losing a job because of things that have happened over the past 30 years? And when you have a culture, if my statistics are still accurate, that roughly 50% of all women will feel abused or not just feel it, but actually experience abuse, that should tell us something about the entire culture. How we raise children from the beginning. And when we seem to believe all over the world that no touch teaches good touch, and it doesn't. We don't seem to know that.
I'd love to add something to that. I'd love to do you think, I often find myself wondering this, having come from a background of a lot of sexual abuse. And as you were saying, this whole idea of, we think that no touch fosters good touch, which is just sort of, when you wake up to that, you realize that's a really sort of silly idea. And I often wonder, as a result of the fearful culture that we've become, that actually the lack of good connection, the lack of good, healthy touch in our youth tends to lead towards more of this incredibly inappropriate touch, because
Absolutely.
there's such a desperation at the level of one's being, not that the behavior is okay or acceptable in any fashion. But I often wonder, gosh, is it that people, particularly, men, that the only kind of touch that's really okay is sexual touch?
Or violence, yeah.
And so then it becomes, the only way to try to get connection, which for most people becomes very damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. In my work with teenagers in the United States, it's very clear to me, if you just wander around in high school, when I wander around, and I touch all the time, teenagers know two forms of touch. Even if you just brush by a guy and you're another guy, that can mean a fight or it means you're gay. If you touch a girl, that means, well, do we have to have a baby now?
Okay.
There's no affectionate touch that does not fall under aggressive categories. They don't know how to have affectionate touch that does not mean either sex or violence, because they haven't experienced it. They don't know how to give it, and they don't know how to receive it. One teenager in New York City, after a workshop, a gang member said to me, He had tears in his eyes and said, "But I didn't know I didn't have to fight." He just simply didn't know it. Not just intellectually, he didn't know it. His body didn't know it.
Right. Yeah.
And so the reflex to fight happens, I've been told, in less than half a second. So you have to build a system, in which original play does, that operates in the human body with a response in less than half a second. Otherwise, you get violence. And it's, in part, every adult needs to face a very simple question and sit down and ask themselves, do I believe that conflict is necessary? And really, not from what some author said, but what do you believe personally? Is it necessary for education? Is it necessary for business, for medicine, for life itself? And you find many scientists, authors, people say absolutely necessary. It's natural. We need it. It's how we succeed. It's how we defend ourselves. And if that's the belief system, one of the end results is loneliness, because you're going to defend yourself. And once you start down that road, well, we know where it ends, because there's no out. Contests do not help people get out of contests.
And it's becoming more clear that people just don't know any other way. They haven't experienced any other way. The culture of trauma from one generation to the next just kind of begins to proliferate. And I think we're reaching this incredible tipping point where it now is an epidemic. It's an epidemic of loneliness. It's an epidemic of disconnection. And so that's, it's one of the reasons why I love facilitating experiences with clients and spaces where people can re-submerge themselves in the wisdom of nature, to feel that sense of connection, to feel that sense of safety, and discover how to find that place of belonging within themselves. And the work that you do, Fred, with play and taking people through these very beautiful experiences of connection with one another in a way that they didn't know was even possible. I'm grateful that these young children and these animals, and that there are still these roadmaps that are available for us to ground ourselves back into, and to find a way back, not only to dissolving the fear and shame that we're carrying around that isn't necessarily ours, is what's been given to us, but to actually have those environments of experiencing a sense of safety, and begin to find our way to our innate, natural nature, the way that we actually do connect, the way that we do play, the way that we do engage with each other. So thank you so much for being willing to kind of talk with me a little bit about this. I think it's a fascinating time with which we're alive right now, and reaching such a critical point for the need to connect, and to kind of come into the vulnerability and the courage that is required to put the cell phones down, to say I'm feeling lost, to say I'm feeling deeply lonely, to be in a space of I don't know what to do, and I long for someone to just listen or see me. The depth of honesty that's needed, and the vulnerability that's needed, it requires an incredible amount of courage. but I don't know about you, but I feel grateful and excited to be alive in a time when we are going through this incredible transition, and finding our way back to connection.
Yeah, I consider my life to be an adventure in loving. That's the art.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share again with you.
Thank
Always a
you.
pleasure.
Yeah, I love these conversations.
Yeah,
So, if any of you that are listening or watching would like some support, Fred and I are going to be doing a workshop on the power of play this September, and going to be creating a space for you to come and connect both with horses, with us, and with each other through experiences of play with horses and experiences of play with Fred and with one another. We would very much love to see you and have the chance to
yeah.
connect. So feel free to look up the information if you're interested. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.